In modern society, the status of commoners is unparalleledly high. Whether in the East or the West, the status of modern commoners far exceeds that in ancient times. For a group to elevate its status, ultimately, it must be able to win battles against another group on the battlefield. Simply relying on pity won't work. In primitive society, everyone was equal. The scarcity of resources was one reason for this equality, but not the main one. If being poor could lead to equality, the cannibal tribes in Africa would have achieved equality long ago. The biggest reason for equality at that time was the backwardness of weapons. Everyone used wooden sticks and stone weapons. With such weapons, the combat effectiveness among people couldn't vary greatly. You could enslave others, but as long as slaves could get their hands on wood and stones, they would have the same combat power as you. Given an opportunity, they could kill you. Since wood and stones were everywhere and it was impossible to prevent slaves from coming into contact with them when they did work, there was no such thing as sacrificing slaves in primitive tribes. Captives were simply killed without exception. If human weapons had remained in the Stone Age, humans would never have entered the slave society. However, one day, a person accidentally threw a bronze ore into a fire, and then forged the sharpest and most durable stone weapon in human history. Based on this, the bronze weapon was soon invented. Warriors holding bronze weapons could kill warriors holding stone weapons as easily as cutting grass. How to forge bronze weapons was a secret at that time. It required special bronze ores and a melting furnace. Slaves doing manual work couldn't just conjure up bronze weapons. From this day on, one part of humanity had a dominant power advantage over another part, and humans entered the slave era. The slave era was an era when the social status gap between people was the greatest. Since commoners had no means of resistance and couldn't fight without bronze weapons, they could only be slaves. For a very long time, the bronze handle was regarded as a national treasure. But this thing was used for cooking. Why was it a national treasure? It wasn't because people couldn't eat without it. The key was that it consumed a large amount of bronze. Thousands of years ago, if you had so much bronze, you were the ruler. This bronze handle could be melted down at any time to produce a large number of bronze swords and create a large armed force. Therefore, the bronze handle was a national treasure and also a way to show national strength. The emergence of metal weapons made it almost impossible for slaves to overthrow the rule of slave owners. However, slave owners wanted more land and slaves. Merely having metal weapons was not enough to meet their military needs. Soon, iron weapons were discovered, but they didn't change the social form because the difficulty of obtaining and using iron swords was similar to that of bronze swords. However, then armor appeared. The emergence of armor shook the division of labor in the slave system and led humanity into the feudal era. The status of commoners was greatly improved. In the age of cold weapons, armor was like a god. Emperor Taizong of the Tang dynasty waged wars everywhere. His core force, the Shanjia army, actually had only about 3,000 men. But several hundred Shanjia soldiers could often break through armies of tens of thousands on the battlefield, and were extremely powerful. We all know about the knight culture in Europe. Knights had high martial prowess and status. The reason why knights were so powerful was mainly due to their armor. After putting on armor, when you attacked others, it was like cutting through them one by one, but you were invulnerable. If your opponent was unarmed, you entered an invincible mode. Don't think that armor was so bulky that it made movement impossible. In fact, after putting on armor, you could do push-ups and even somersaults. If you were an unarmed commoner and a knight in such iron armor charged towards you, what would you think? Every knight, even when dismounted, was a top-heavy infantryman with amazing combat effectiveness. Such powerful armor was undoubtedly very expensive, and ordinary people couldn't bear its weight. Those commoners who were often hungry and couldn't have a meat meal for a whole year definitely couldn't wear it. Even if they managed to put it on, they couldn't walk far. Every knight had to eat well every meal and even have meat every day. They needed long-term physical training. In addition to their own ironclad bodies, knights also put a set of iron armor on their horses. Horses that could support such burly knights, plus the weight of 1 ton of armor and charge on the battlefield naturally weren't ordinary horses. They required top-quality war horses, and the price of each was equivalent to 5 to 10 years' income of a commoner. And the standard equipment for a knight was 1 or even 2 or 3 horses per person, so as to maximize combat effectiveness on the battlefield. Such a heavily invested knight naturally had high requirements for combat skills. Therefore, every knight had to study combat techniques for more than 10 years to fully utilize the combat effectiveness of the armor and warhorse. This was the European knight. Usually, at least 100 peasant households were needed to support one knight. Many people misunderstand European knights. For the cavalry in China, I just can't understand why there is a knight culture in Europe, and I can't understand even more why knights have such a high status. Strictly speaking, knights are not the same as cavalry. Knights are equivalent to generals in the Three Kingdoms period. Zhao Yun could charge in and out 7 times among the rabble at Changbun Slope, which cavalry couldn't achieve. The difference lies in the full set of armor. With this, a general can kill enemies without being injured. Before a knight's physical strength is exhausted, countless peasant soldiers couldn't defeat a medieval knight. Therefore, European feudal lords needed knights. Such knights couldn't be conscripted just by temporarily distributing weapons. Lords would grant land to knights. Each knight was a noble and a small feudal lord. In the slave era, kings and lords only needed to control bronze weapons to control everything and didn't need so many people to share power. But after the emergence of armor, a strong general could unleash extremely powerful combat effectiveness. The physical strength of such a general couldn't be achieved by everyone. Moreover, to maintain combat effectiveness, generals also needed a life of comfort. So slave owners needed to select a group of strong men to be knights and grant them part of the power. Knights also had to have some men as their squires. Otherwise, they couldn't give full play to their combat effectiveness. Therefore, knights also had to treat some commoners well, and couldn't be too harsh on the peasants under their rule. Because when necessary, they also needed to conscript them to fight together. Thus, in the feudal era, the common people generally lived better than in the slave era. If human weapons had always remained in the armor era, humanity would have always stayed in the feudal era. But then the musket was born. Muskets had the ability to penetrate armor, which shattered the foundation of the feudal era. A knight wearing an extremely expensive full suit of armor, and having practiced martial arts for 10 years, was shot dead by a peasant who had only trained for half a month with a matchlock gun. How could one argue about it? From the moment the matchlock gun was born, the European aristocratic system was shaken. The knight group, headed by the king, refused to relinquish power and tried to maintain the old ruling system, but was smashed by a vast number of musketeers. It is said in history books that it was the capitalists who overthrew the European feudal system. This statement is both right and wrong. The king was overthrown by the capitalists, but the most crucial reason for his downfall was that the king ran out of money. In the past, when the king conscripted knights, it didn't cost money. The granted land was already their salary. But when knights lost their dominance on the battlefield, whenever the king went to war, he had to conscript countless musketeers. The tactics of using a few hundred knights to directly overrun the battlefield no longer worked. During World War I, 33 countries involved in the war deployed more than 70 million troops, with over 10 million deaths. With such a mobilization scale and number of troops, the traditional feudal system simply couldn't organize them. The king simply didn't have the money or the organizational ability and had to rely on capitalists. The moment musketeers dominated the battlefield, the king's power actually ceased to exist. He had to share power and treat every commoner as a knight. Only then would the people be willing to fight. However, power is limited. If you grant power to all the people, then privileges no longer exist. The king wouldn't accept this. The Qing emperors, after seeing the foreign muskets, chose to seal them away immediately. It wasn't because the Qing emperors were stupid, but because they were too smart and knew that muskets would shake the foundation of the Qing dynasty's rule. European kings also rejected muskets and once tried to ban them. But because they were divided into multiple small countries and wars were constant, if you didn't use them while others did, they were ultimately forced to accept and then lost their thrones one after another. Muskets are powerful, but they have a drawback: they need a person to operate them. Humans are very useful, but they have a drawback: they have their own thoughts. With the same weapons and equipment, 1 million people can't defeat 10 million people. But how to get 10 million people to fight for you is a big problem. However, the capitalist system didn't decentralize power enough, so the mobilization and organizational capabilities were not maximized. During World War II, the Soviet Union had a population of 180 million. 27 million died and 33 million were injured, with casualties exceeding one-third of the total population, yet they continued to fight. The German army suffered about 3 million casualties and then collapsed and fled. The Soviet Red Army, despite suffering millions of casualties, still maintained peak combat effectiveness. Every year, everyone thought the Soviet Army was about to run out of troops, but every year, there were endless new Soviet Red Army troops emerging. In the last year, there were still over 10 million Red Army soldiers. What limited the Soviet Army's ceiling was supplies, not organizational capacity. The Soviet Union achieved an almost infinite organizational capacity, which no one has been able to measure the upper limit of to this day. Infinite decentralization gave the Soviet Union almost infinite organizational capacity, and this organizational capacity also made the Soviet Union invincible on the battlefield. Capitalist countries would be invincible on the battlefield unless they were willing to decentralize power. Otherwise, even if Nazi ideology were used to unify the nation, Germany's organizational capacity would already be at its limit, and it still couldn't defeat the Soviet Union. By decentralizing power to the common soldiers really couldn't fight against the knights. So the feudal system in the Age of Knights was the optimal system. Chiang Kai-shek was particularly good at the feudal system. He focused on building his own clique troops and was also good at buying off the opposing side's key generals. This was completely the feudal way, except that the generals were turned into senior knights. If it were in the feudal era, Chiang Kai-shek would have been an excellent founding emperor. Unfortunately, he encountered Mao Zedong, a communist leader. Decentralizing power enabled the People's Liberation Army to have far greater organizational capabilities than the Kuomintang Army and unleash a combat effectiveness that Chiang Kai-shek couldn't understand. Later, when the United States deployed forces on the Korean battlefield, it was badly beaten. In today's human society, with the current form of weapons, ordinary civilians can be trained for a few months and then go to the battlefield. It is especially suitable for civilians to give full play to their strength. The Chinese people have such a high status, which was not given by anyone's charity. It was won by the people on the battlefield. To win a war, the more people are needed, the more rights modern civilians have. After the Soviet Union's miraculous victory in World War II, people all over the world witnessed a great liberation. The rights of ordinary people in any country are far greater than before World War II, including those in Europe and the United States themselves. After the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the rights of ordinary people in Europe and the United States have significantly declined. A group of rednecks protest every day, nostalgic for the affluent life in the 1970s and 1980s. Are the protests of the rednecks useful? No, since winning wars doesn't require them, why should they be treated so well? Trump fought for the rights of the rednecks not because he was a savior. Instead, it's because China's power is too strong and poses a threat to the United States. So appeasing the rednecks in the United States and giving them a share of power has become something that the United States needs to consider. If China wins again, the rights obtained by people all over the world will also increase, including those of European and American citizens. Otherwise, they will decline. The reason is simple. No ruler is willing to share power unless not sharing power means they can't win the war.